The winter of 1935 did not arrive gently in Harlem. It came in thin gray light that clung to brownstone windows like exhaustion. It came in the quiet scraping of shoes against frozen sidewalks. It came in conversations that stopped when police officers walked too slowly down Lenox Avenue. And it came with rumors that Harlem was not unfamiliar with injustice. In fact, injustice often moved through the neighborhood like a regular customer, unwelcome but expected. Yet this time something felt different. Something heavier. Something deliberate. At the center of it all stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He was not the tallest man in the room. He was not the loudest. He did not dress to intimidate. But when Bumpy entered a room, the air shifted, not because of fear, but because of composure. His suits were tailored, his shoes polished, his posture upright, like a man who understood that dignity was armor, and dignity in Harlem was sacred. That evening, Bumpy sat in the back office of a modest nightclub on 138th Street. Jazz filtered through the walls, muted trumpet, brushed snare, low piano chords that sounded like someone thinking out loud. Across from him sat three of his trusted men, Red Carter, Moses Grant, and young Calvin Reed. They were not criminals. In this moment, they were guardians of their block, protectors of shopkeepers who couldn't afford protection from the law, men who knew how easily a single spark could ignite unrest in a community already bruised. Calvin was the first to speak. They took him, he said quietly. Bumpy did not react immediately. Who? He asked calmly. Thomas Bell, from the pharmacy on 7th. Police said it was questioning. But his wife says they hit him in front of the children. Silence. Bumpy folded his hands on the desk. His eyes lowered, not in defeat, but in calculation. The men watched him carefully. They had seen anger before, but rarely from him. On what charge? Bumpy asked. They didn't say. Of course they didn't. Single quotes. In Harlem, questioning often meant humiliation. It meant fear. It meant fathers returning home different than they left. Outside, the music swelled briefly, then softened. Red shifted in his chair. We can go. Down there, he muttered. Let them know we're watching. Bumpy's eyes lifted slowly. And what does that accomplish? He asked evenly. Red looked down. Bumpy stood and walked to the window. From there he could see the street. Children darting between street lamps, women carrying groceries, men standing in quiet clusters exchanging rumors. Harlem was watching. They want a reaction, Bumpy said finally. They want headlines. They want to prove we're exactly what they say we are. He turned back toward the room. But we are not chaos. His voice was soft. And we will not become it. The room fell still. That was Bumpy's gift. He never needed to raise his voice. His authority came from control, especially when control was hardest. Just then, the office door opened gently. It was Miss Lillian, the club's bookkeeper, her face pale. There's a crowd forming near the station, she said. Words spreading. Bumpy nodded once. Thank you, Miss Lillian. She hesitated before leaving. Be careful, she whispered. The door closed. Moses exhaled slowly. This could turn ugly. Bumpy reached for his hat. Only if we let it. The police station stood like a block of cold stone at the edge of Harlem, solid, indifferent, unmoved by the emotion gathering outside it. Nearly 100 people had formed a loose circle around the entrance. No shouting, no violence, just tension. Mothers stood with folded arms. Young men shifted restlessly. Elders shook their heads in quiet disbelief. When Bumpy arrived, conversation slowed. He did not push through the crowd. He walked steadily, greeting people by name. Evening, Mrs. Jacobs. How's your boy, Mr. Whitaker? Dignity travels by recognition. At the front, Calvin whispered. They've had him 6 hours. Bumpy nodded. Then he did something unexpected. He stepped forward. Alone. No entourage. No threats. Just one composed man walking toward a building that had swallowed too many fathers. The officer at the entrance stiffened when he saw him. "You can't be here," the officer said sharply. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Bumpy replied calmly. "I'm here to ask a question." The officer's jaw tightened. "This isn't your business." Bumpy's eyes never wavered. "When a man is struck in front of his children," he said evenly, "it becomes everyone's business." The officer glanced at the growing crowd. Tension trembled in the air like a held breath. "You're inciting," the officer muttered. "No," Bumpy replied softly. "I'm preventing." The statement hung there because it was true. Inside that station sat a frightened pharmacist. Outside stood a community ready to fracture. And between them stood Bumpy Johnson. "Let me speak to your captain," Bumpy said. The officer hesitated. The crowd did not move. They did not shout. They watched. Minutes later, the captain emerged, older, hardened by years of authority rarely questioned. "What's this about?" the captain demanded. Bumpy removed his hat respectfully. "Sir," he said calmly, "Thomas Bell is a respected business owner. If there are charges, they should be stated. If not, he should return home." The captain studied him. "You threatening?" Me? No, sir," Bumpy replied. "I'm reminding you that Harlem is watching. And Harlem remembers." There was no hostility in his voice, only truth. The captain looked at the crowd again, quiet, dignified, united. Chaos would justify force. Dignity required response. After a long pause, the captain sighed. "Release him." A ripple passed through the crowd, not cheers, not shouts. Relief. Thomas Bell emerged 30 minutes later, bruised but upright. His wife ran to him, children clinging to his coat. The crowd parted respectfully, and Bumpy stepped back. He did not smile. He did not boast. He simply placed his hat back on his head and turned toward Lenox Avenue. Calvin caught up with him. "You didn't even argue." Bumpy glanced at him gently. "Power," he said, "is knowing when not to." But Harlem's story was not finished, because sometimes the first victory only reveals a larger shadow. 2 nights later, word arrived from a train conductor traveling north. In a southern county, 11 black laborers had been publicly beaten and their homes burned under false accusations stirred by a white supremacist mob. There were whispers of masked men. There were whispers of silence from local authorities. And there were whispers that similar tactics might spread northward as tensions rose. The room grew heavy as the details unfolded. Red stood abruptly. "This is war," he muttered. Bumpy remained seated. "No," he said quietly, "it's fear." Red shook his head. "You can't reason with hate." "Perhaps not," Bumpy replied. "But you can expose it." That was the beginning of something larger. Not retaliation, not violence, but strategy. And as Harlem slept beneath a cold sky, Bumpy Johnson began planning not revenge, but illumination, because dignity, once awakened, does not retreat easily. And Harlem had just remembered its strength. The release of Thomas Bell should have calmed Harlem. Instead, it sharpened it. There's a difference between relief and resolution. Harlem understood that difference instinctively. Thomas had come home. His children slept beside him that night. His wife pressed ice to his bruises and whispered prayers of gratitude. But the air in the neighborhood did not lighten. It thickened, because everyone knew something else had shifted. The Southern report of 11 brutalized men had not faded into rumor. It had hardened into confirmation. Burned houses, public beatings, local officials who claimed insufficient evidence, masked figures who disappeared before dawn. And then came the second letter. It arrived folded inside a train porter's jacket pocket 3 nights later. The porter had been the same man who delivered the first news. His hands trembled again, but not from cold this time. He handed the envelope to Bumpy in the back room of the nightclub, where the jazz had grown slower and more reflective in recent evenings. Bumpy did not open it immediately. He looked at the porter first. Are you safe? He asked quietly. The porter nodded. For now. That answer lingered too long. Bumpy opened the letter. It was written by the schoolteacher of the southern town. A black woman who had once believed education could soften even the hardest prejudice. The ink was slightly smeared, as though written in haste or tears. She described how the mob had returned, not to attack again, but to intimidate. To stand silently outside homes at night. To leave charred wood and broken tools on porches as reminders. The 11 men were alive, but their dignity had been publicly stripped. And worse, the sheriff had declared the matter closed. When Bumpy finished reading, the room was silent. Red stood by the window, fists clenched. Calvin paced near the door. Moses sat forward, elbows on knees, eyes burning. Dutch Schultz was present again, unusually quiet. He had not spoken much since Thomas Bell's release. Perhaps he was learning something. Perhaps he was wrestling with something. Finally Red spoke. They think we won't reach that far, he said. They think Harlem's too busy surviving to care. Bumpy folded the letter carefully. They are counting on exhaustion, he said calmly. And? Moses asked. And we will give them endurance. There was something different in his tone now. Not louder, not angrier, but deeper, because this was no longer about a single arrest. This was about the architecture of humiliation. And architecture must be dismantled with precision. The turning point of this chapter did not begin with confrontation. It began with silence. Bumpy instructed his men to do nothing publicly for 48 hours. No statements. No gatherings. No visible reaction. Harlem murmured in confusion. Some thought fear had taken hold. Others assumed strategy. In truth, Bumpy was building something quieter than outrage. He visited Reverend Samuel Clayton at dawn the following morning. The church was empty, except for dust particles dancing in thin beams of winter light. Reverend Clayton was a man of measured speech and steady moral force. He did not seek headlines. He sought integrity. Bumpy removed his hat. I need your pulpit, he said simply. The Reverend studied him carefully. For what purpose? To remind people who they are. The Reverend did not answer immediately. Finally he nodded. You will speak Sunday. But Bumpy was not finished. He visited a white journalist named Margaret Harlow, a woman known for writing stories that made editors uncomfortable and readers unsettled. She had covered labor abuses, prison corruption, and discriminatory housing practices. She had been threatened before. She opened her office door cautiously. Mr. Johnson, she said, surprised but composed. I believe you're looking for your next story, he replied. She arched an eyebrow. Am I? He placed the schoolteacher's letter on her desk. You're looking in the wrong places, he said calmly. She read. Her face changed. Is this verified? It will be, Bumpy answered. She looked up at him carefully. Why bring this to me? Because sunlight travels farther than anger. There it was again. Light. He left without another word. Sunday arrived heavy. The church overflowed long before service began. Not because of spectacle, but because word had traveled in quiet currents. Bumpy Johnson would speak, not as a businessman, not as a figure whispered about in newspapers, but as a man addressing his community. He stepped to the pulpit without theatrics. The room fell into a silence so complete it felt sacred. He did not mention revenge. He did not mention retaliation. He spoke of dignity. He spoke of history, of people who survived worse without surrendering who they were. He spoke of masks, men who hide behind cloth, he said evenly. Do so because they fear being recognized for what they are. No applause. Just breath. And when they believe we are too scattered to care, he continued, they grow bold. His eyes moved across the congregation. But we are not scattered. His final words were soft. We are watching. That was all. No threats. No slogans. Just awareness. The congregation stood not in celebration, but an understanding. And outside those church walls, Margaret Harlow's article began moving through printing presses. 3 days later, the story broke nationally. The headline did not scream. It exposed. It detailed the 11 men, their occupations, their families, the sheriff's dismissal, the intimidation campaign, the failure of local oversight. It named the silence. Letters began arriving at the Southern County office. Editorials questioned the sheriff's competence. Federal authorities were pressured to review the case. The masks metaphorically began to slip. Back in Harlem, tension shifted from helplessness to focus. Red approached Bumpy one evening. "You knew this would work," he said quietly. Bumpy shook his head slightly. "I knew it might. And if it hadn't?" Bumpy's expression did not change. "Then we would try something else." There was no arrogance in him, only persistence. But the story did not end neatly. Because power resists. Exposure. 2 nights after the article ran, Margaret Harlow's office window was smashed. A note left on her desk read, "Stay out of it." And the schoolteacher in the southern town received a visit from men who asked too many questions about her loyalty. Fear began creeping again. This time, it reached Harlem faster. Calvin burst into the nightclub office, breathless. "They're pushing back," he said. Red slammed his fist against the wall. "They think intimidation works." Bumpy remained seated. Double quotes, "Yes," he said calmly. "They do." He stood slowly, "Which means we have made them uncomfortable." There was steel beneath his composure now. He called Margaret personally. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "I've been afraid before," she replied honestly. "Good," Bumpy said. "That means you understand what they want." "And what do you want?" she asked. "For you to keep writing." A pause. "And you?" she asked. "I will keep standing." The true turning point of Part 2 came not in Harlem, not in Georgia, not in a newsroom. It came in a courtroom. Federal investigators, under mounting public pressure, opened a preliminary hearing into the Southern sheriff's conduct. It was not a dramatic trial. It was procedural, technical, slow, but it was official. The sheriff sat under questioning for the first time in his career. Outside the courthouse, masked men did not gather. Because the nation was watching. In Harlem, word arrived through telegram. "Moses, read it aloud." The room remained quiet. Red exhaled slowly. Calvin smiled for the first time in days. Dutch Schultz leaned back thoughtfully. "And Bumpy?" He simply nodded once, not triumph, not celebration. Acknowledgement. Because the goal had never been humiliation. It had been accountability. That evening, Bumpy walked alone down Lenox Avenue. Children were laughing again. Shopkeepers nodded respectfully. Music floated from open windows. Harlem felt steadier, but he knew something others did not yet fully grasp. Exposure changes power structures. And when power shifts, desperation follows. This was not over, because men who wear masks do not disappear. Quietly. They adapt. They regroup. They whisper. And somewhere, someone was already planning the next move. Bumpy stopped beneath a street lamp, the cold light outlining his silhouette. He adjusted his coat collar and looked north, beyond Harlem, beyond state lines. "They will test us again," he murmured softly. And when they do, Harlem would not answer with chaos. It would answer with composure, with strategy, with unshakable dignity. Because now the masks had begun to fall. And once people see what hides behind them, they never forget. Harlem did not sleep the night the cross burned. It wasn't large. It wasn't cinematic in the way newspapers would later describe it. It stood crooked and poorly assembled in an empty lot 3 blocks from Lenox Avenue, flames licking upward against the winter sky like a signal meant to travel farther than fire ever could. It was not the size that mattered. It was the message. Someone had driven in from outside the neighborhood. Someone had risked visibility. Someone believed Harlem needed to be reminded of its place. The police arrived quickly, faster than usual. They extinguished the fire, took brief notes, asked no serious questions, and left with practiced indifference. But the image had already burned deeper than wood by sunrise. Every barber shop, every grocery counter, every church vestibule carried the same quiet tremor. They brought it north, and that was new. Bumpy Johnson was awake before dawn. He had received the call at 2:17 a.m. He did not rush to the scene. He did not storm the streets. He waited until morning because fear thrives in darkness, and daylight reveals proportions. When he arrived at the lot, ash still smoked faintly in the cold air. The charred wood lay collapsed, and a blackened ex-neighbors stood in clusters, speaking in low tones. Children were being kept inside. Red Carter's jaw was tight enough to crack stone. "They want a reaction," Red said. "They're baiting." "U.S. Yes," Bumpy replied calmly. And we will not bite." Red turned sharply. "They burned a cross in our streets." Bumpy knelt beside the ash. He touched the blackened wood gently. "Then let it be the last thing they burn." There was something steady in his voice, something unbreakable. But beneath it, calculation, because this was no longer about southern counties. This was psychological warfare, and the battlefield had shifted. By noon, whispers had spread beyond Harlem. The newspaper that had exposed the Southern brutality ran a short column about racial provocation in northern neighborhoods. Margaret Harlow requested comment. Bumpy declined. He understood timing. He called a private meeting instead. Not in the nightclub, not in the church, but in the Harlem Community Hall, a neutral ground where business owners, pastors, teachers, and labor leaders gathered. When he entered, the room was already tense. Voices overlapped. Fear mingled with anger. Some demanded armed patrols. Others demanded public protest. A few spoke of retaliation. Bumpy did not interrupt. He listened. And when the room began to spiral into louder exchanges, he simply stood. No gavel, no raised voice. Just presence. The room quieted gradually, like water settling after disturbance. "They are testing the temperature," he said evenly. "They want to see if we fracture." A teacher spoke up. "What if this escalates?" "It will," Bumpy replied calmly. The blunt honesty startled them. "But escalation," he continued, "does not mean surrender. And it does not mean chaos." He looked around the room. "Tonight, we do not gather in anger, murmurs. We gather in light." That evening, instead of confrontation, Harlem did something unexpected. They filled the streets. Not shouting, not marching, walking. Families carried lanterns. Shopkeepers closed early and joined. Church choirs hummed spirituals softly as they moved block to block. It was not organized as protest. It was presence. Bumpy walked near the center, not leading, not commanding, simply visible. The message was subtle but undeniable. We are not afraid of our own streets. From apartment windows, faces watched. From parked cars at distant corners, other faces watched too. The wrong kind. But there was no chaos to photograph. No violence to report. Only dignity. And that is when the letter arrived. It was slipped under the door of the nightclub office after midnight. Red found it. First. Typed. Unsigned. Direct. Harlem is not beyond reach. No threats of fire. No explicit violence. Just implication. Red crumpled it in his fist. "This is it," he said. "They're not stopping." Bumpy unfolded it carefully. He read it twice. Then he did something that stunned everyone in the room. He smiled just slightly. "They are nervous," he said quietly. Red stared. Nervous? If they were confident, they would not write. There it was again. Perspective. Bumpy understood something crucial. Power that threatens anonymously is unsure of itself. But then something shifted. 2 nights later, a young Harlem man named Isaiah Moore was stopped by police on his way home from work. He had attended the Lantern Walk. He had spoken proudly about it. He was detained for suspicious behavior. And this time, He did not return by morning. The tension changed. This was no longer symbolic. This was personal. Isaiah was 22. A delivery driver. No record. Known in the community for helping elderly neighbors carry groceries upstairs. His mother came to Bumpy's office before sunrise. She did not cry. She stood rigid, as though fear had frozen her entirely. "They won't tell me where he is," she said. That sentence carried more weight than the burning cross ever could, because now the intimidation had moved from symbol to flesh. Red's hands trembled, not with fear, but with contained fury. "This is where we stop talking," he said. But Bumpy did not rise immediately. He looked at Isaiah's mother first. "You trust me?" he asked gently. She nodded without hesitation. That trust was heavier than any weapon. The true suspense of this chapter did not lie in violence. It lay in whether Bumpy's method would hold. He walked to the police station alone. Again. No crowd. This time. No lanterns. Just quiet footsteps against pavement. The same captain met him at the door. "You again?" The captain muttered. Double quotes. "Yes," Bumpy replied calmly. "This is harassment," the captain said. "You stirring people up." "I am preventing that," Bumpy answered softly. The captain exhaled sharply. "The boy's being questioned. For what?" "Routine inquiry." Bumpy held his gaze. "You detained him after a peaceful walk. Coincidence?" Silence hung between them. The captain leaned closer. "You think I don't know what you're doing? Articles, walks, pressure. You think you're untouchable." Bumpy did not flinch. "I am not untouchable," he said quietly. "I am accountable," the captain scoffed. "To who?" Bumpy's answer was immediate. "To them." He gestured subtly. "Toward Harlem, and to history." The captain hesitated. History was not something lawmen liked being measured against. Bumpy's final words were almost a whisper. "If Isaiah Moore walks out bruised or broken, the story will not remain local." There was no threat, just inevitability. The captain studied him long. And then, grudgingly, "He'll be released." But the suspense did not end there. When Isaiah emerged 2 hours later, he was shaken, but unhurt. The community gathered quietly as he stepped into daylight. No cheering, no spectacle. Just relief. His mother embraced him. Red wiped his eyes discreetly. "And Bumpy?" He stepped back once more. Because this was not about him. It was about precedent. Harlem had just sent a message. Intimidation will be exposed, every time. That night, Dutch Schultz found Bumpy alone in the office. "You keep choosing restraint," Dutch said quietly. "Yes. One day they might not." Bumpy looked at him calmly. "And if we abandon ours," he said, "what separates us?" Dutch had no answer. But the real turning point came the following week. Margaret Harlow's follow-up article connected the cross-burning and Isaiah's detention to a pattern of coordinated intimidation by outside agitators seeking to provoke racial unrest. The narrative shifted nationally, not Harlem unrest, but organized provocation. That difference mattered. Federal oversight increased. Local officials became cautious. The masked presence receded. Not erased, but cautious, because Harlem had refused to perform the role expected of it. And that refusal was power. On a quiet evening beneath winter stars, Bumpy stood once more on Lenox Avenue. "Ever get tired?" Red asked. "Yes," Bumpy said honestly. "Ever get scared?" "Yes." Red looked surprised. "But fear," Bumpy continued, "is not the enemy. What is? Losing who you are." They stood in silence. The cross had burned. The letter had threatened. Isaiah had been detained. But Harlem had not broken. And somewhere beyond the city, men who wore masks realized something unsettling. They had underestimated composure. They had underestimated strategy. They had underestimated a community that chose dignity over chaos. And the most powerful thing of all, They had underestimated Bumpy Johnson. Winter tightened its grip on Harlem as February deepened. The air carried a sharper bite now, the kind that turned breath visible and footsteps deliberate. The cross had burned. The letter had threatened. Isaiah had returned home. And yet, Bumpy Johnson felt something unfinished. Victory, he knew, was not loud. It was fragile. When fear fails, humiliation often follows. And humiliation was the last weapon left. The call came just after midnight. Not from a porter, not from a journalist, not from the police. From Reverend Clayton. "They're planning something public," the Reverend said, voice steady but low. "A rally, downtown. They're calling it a law and order assembly." Bumpy did not speak. Immediately, he understood coded language. Law and order. It meant reassertion. It meant intimidation dressed as patriotism. "They've secured permits." The Reverend continued. "They intend to speak about outside agitators, northern troublemakers." Bumpy exhaled slowly. "They want a stage, yes, and they expect protest." Yes, there it was. The trap, if Harlem responded with confrontation, newspapers would photograph shouting crowds. Headlines would blur nuance into chaos. The narrative would shift from intimidation to disorder. Masks would slip back on. And those who lit fires would claim they were merely protecting peace. Bumpy closed his eyes for a brief moment. This was the most dangerous moment yet, because anger would be justified, and justified anger is the easiest to weaponize. The meeting at Community Hall the next afternoon was more volatile than any before it. "They're marching through our dignity," Red said sharply. "Downtown or not, it's aimed at us." "They want to show numbers," Moses added. "Show dominance," Calvin paced. "We should counter-rally." Voices rose quickly this time. The tension was raw. Bumpy let it crest. Then he stood. "We will attend," he said. The room froze. Red stared. "Attend?" "Yes, Bumpy. That's their rally." "Yes," the words settled heavily. "We will attend," Bumpy repeated calmly, in silence. Murmurs broke out. "They'll mock us. They'll provoke. They'll try to bait." "Yes," Bumpy said evenly. "And we will not give them what they want." He walked slowly to the center of the room. "They are building a stage to perform strength." His voice was steady. "We will show them composure." The day of the rally dawned cold and clear. The courthouse steps downtown were draped in American flags. Speakers were arranged. Police presence was heavier than usual. Men in suits gathered first. Then more arrived, some from outside neighborhoods. Some faces had been seen before near the burned lot. Others were strangers. The rhetoric began predictably. Talk of order. Talk of tradition. Talk of outside interference. The crowd applauded on cue. Then something shifted. At the far edge of the square, a line of men and women began to appear. No banners. No signs. No chants. Harlem had arrived. They stood in coats and hats, hands folded, expressions calm. Bumpy Johnson stood at the front, not elevated, not central, simply present. The speaker on stage faltered momentarily. The script had expected shouting. It had expected anger. Instead, it faced stillness. The speaker raised his voice, attempting provocation. "Some people," he declared, "would rather undermine our institutions than respect them." "Silence. We will not be intimidated by mobs." Silence. The words hung hollow, without reaction. The cameras, because cameras were present, panned toward Harlem's line. They captured composed faces, elders, teachers, business owners, children standing beside parents. The narrative began slipping, because outrage makes headlines. Dignity complicates them. Halfway through the rally, one of the speakers, older, red-faced, visibly irritated, pointed toward Harlem's silent presence. "If you have something to say," he shouted, "say it." The square held its breath. Red's jaw tightened beside Bumpy. This was the moment. The test. Bumpy stepped forward, not aggressively, not dramatically. Just one step. He removed his hat, and he spoke clearly enough for the nearby microphones to catch. "We are saying something," he said calmly. The square fell still. "We are saying we belong." No insult, no accusation, no raised tone. Just truth. And then he stepped back. The simplicity disarmed the tension, because what argument could meet that statement without exposing itself? The speaker hesitated. He attempted to resume rhetoric, but the energy had shifted. Audience was no longer unified. Whispers began. Some clapped half-heartedly. Others avoided eye contact. The stage had been built for confrontation. It received composure instead. But the true turning point did not happen on the steps. It happened in the newspapers the next morning. The headline did not read, "Rally faces protest." It read, "Silent Harlem challenges rhetoric with dignity." Photographs showed calm faces beneath winter light. Bumpy's brief statement was quoted in full. "We are saying we belong." Those 4 words traveled farther than any shouted slogan could have. National commentators noted the restraint. Civil leaders referenced the composure. Even critics admitted the optics had favored Harlem. The masks had not burned this time. They had slipped quietly under daylight scrutiny. But there was one final confrontation left. 3 nights after the rally, the same captain who had detained Isaiah requested a private meeting with Bumpy. It was unusual and telling. They met in the captain's office. No audience, no press. The captain closed the door. "You embarrassed people," he said bluntly. Bumpy met his gaze calmly. "We stood." The captain exhaled heavily. "You could have caused trouble. We didn't." Silence stretched. "You know," the captain said slowly, "if you had reacted differently, this city would look very different tonight." Bumpy's answer was quiet. "Because my people deserve stability more than spectacle." Was something new in his expression. Respect. Not agreement. But recognition. "You're a complicated man, Johnson," the captain muttered. "No," Bumpy replied softly. "I'm consistent." Sunday afternoon in the same church where Part 2 had begun. The pews were full, not because of crisis, because of gratitude. Reverend Clayton stood at the pulpit. He did not speak about victory. He spoke about endurance. Then he invited Bumpy forward. Bumpy hesitated slightly. He never sought center stage, but he walked forward. He did not deliver a speech this time. He simply looked out at the congregation. Faces that had feared. Faces that had stood. Faces that had chosen restraint. When chaos beckoned, "You did this," he said quietly. "You chose not to break." Remembering the night he had wanted retaliation, Calvin thought about Isaiah. Isaiah sat beside his mother, upright and unshaken. And in that church, beneath stained glass warmed, something settled into permanence. Harlem had passed its test. Not because intimidation. They did not need to mirror hatred to defeat it. They needed composure, unity, exposure, and refusal. That evening, Bumpy walked Lenox Avenue once more. The winter air still bit. Schultz approached him near the corner. "You turned a rally into a reckoning," Dutch said quietly. Bumpy shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "We turned it into a mirror." Dutch considered that. And what did they see? Bumpy looked down the street at families heading home, laughter drifting through open windows. Themselves. In the end, the loudest sound was silence. The silence of a community that refused to be provoked. The silence of composure in the face of intimidation. One truth remained steady as the man who had guided it through storm. Back, it does not remember who shouted the loudest. It remembers who stood the firmest. Ellsworth.